Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body has finished with sin. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. They are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. But they will have to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is the reason the gospel was preached, even to those who are now dead, so that they might be judged according to human standards in regard to the body, but live according to God in regard to the spirit. The end of all things is near. Therefore be alert and of sober mind, so that you may pray. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. If anyone speaks, they should do so as one who speaks the very words of God. If anyone serves, they should do so with the strength God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. If you suffer, it should not be as a murderer or thief or any other kind of criminal, or even as a meddler. However, if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name. For it is time for judgment to begin with God's household. And if it begins with us, what will the outcome be for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if it is hard for the righteous to be saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? So then, those who suffer according to God's will should commit themselves to their faithful Creator and continue to do good. We'll be coming back to chapter 4 and verses 8 to 10 as we think about our theme of the good news of home in a moment. But first we're going to sing two songs, and the themes really are the wonderful new family that God has brought us into. We were ruined in our sin, and the second verse, you sought out the wanderers, made the prodigals come home. With a lavish feast you welcomed us, for you made us your own. This is the wonderful news of the gospel. And then in the second song we're going to sing, Lord, all sovereign, granting peace from heaven, let me now comfort those who suffer with the comfort you have given. As God embraces us into his home and his love, we can then do the same to others. So let's sing these two songs and then we'll dive into our theme this evening. We were ruined in our sin, and Lord, I come before your throne of grace. And please be seated. It is very bad news when you are loud and your mind wanders somewhere else and you forget to change line. But there we go. We are thinking tonight about the good news of home, about being incredibly welcoming and loving in the world, even though we are seeking to be visibly different. As ever, I'm using Elliot Clark's stories of his time in the Central Asia, in a Muslim-majority culture, how to convey the good news of Jesus Christ there, and using his thoughts on 1 Peter to ground us, and just give us a different perspective. We're going to be looking at 1 Peter 4, 8-10, which I'm going to read, and then I'm going to start actually with a story of my own, and then one of Elliot's. 1 Peter 4, 8-10. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. A couple is walking to church. They have their Bibles tucked under their arms. It's a normal Sunday routine for them. As they are heading to church, they bump into a young man who lives locally, and they say to him, "Would you like to come to church with us?" And he says, "Yeah, okay." Never been to church before. And so he tags along. He goes, and as he attends that meeting and hears the gospel for the first time, his eyes are opened, his heart is gripped. And he responds to the gospel there and then. He becomes a Christian that morning. He goes home and tells his parents that he's been to church and that he's become a Christian. And his parents say to him, "Pack your bags, leave. We're not having a Christian in our house." So this poor young man, a complete loss now, packs a suitcase and wanders back up to the church building, because that's the only place he knows where there are Christians. They haven't finished yet, thankfully, and the couple who invited him to church that morning are still there, and they recognize now that he needs somewhere to live. And so they invite him to come and live with them. That's not Central Asia. That's England about 70 years ago. And that man was Len Gamston, who then preached at my grandfather's funeral, and my uncle, who's here tonight, was converted not long after, and the gospel came to our family. But that couple who'd invited that young man to church needed to provide him a home, because he was thrown out of his. Now listen to a story from Elliot Clark. I leaned forward on the edge of the cushioned armchair, prayerful and unnerved. My palms were clammy, my lungs heavy. On the table next to me sat my Bible. In its front cover, I had tucked a letter for Hira. Hira was the middle-aged and single mother of Miriam, a teenage girl we'd met 6 months previously. Now both of them were in the kitchen with my wife while I waited impatiently in the living room. Our families had just finished a meal together, but next came our usual after-dinner conversation. A conversation I was dreading. Since our first encounter with Miriam, we had made it our purpose to befriend Hira, her mother. Over the course of those months, our relationship with both of them grew through regular hospitality. Nearly every week, they would come to our home for dinner or desserts, or we would go to theirs. Inevitably, either at the table or on the floor afterwards, we would enter into a lively debate about Christianity. Hira had strong convictions about Islam. She was also concerned, not surprisingly, by the influence we were having on her daughter. However, our disagreements didn't keep us apart. Over the course of time and over a lot of good food, we became genuine friends. Hira was incredibly gracious to us and felt a special kinship with my wife. They shared the same birth year, they shared many of the same health issues, and now in a way they both shared the same daughter. Miriam had recently come to faith in Christ and already started to view us as an extension of her family. Now she was ready to be baptized. Hira, however, was slower to believe. She was still unconvinced by the gospel and remained skeptical of the Jesus that we proclaimed. When Hira came in from the kitchen, she sat down across the table from me. Her breathing was uneven. I slowly took the paper from my Bible, unfolded it, and asked her to read the prepared agreement. Since her daughter was a minor, we were asking for parental consent, including her signature, to baptize Miriam. This was our way of honoring Hira. So I candidly reiterated our terms. We will not do this without your permission. As the words exited my mouth, I prepared for the worst. But then, almost without hesitation, she signed it. She even agreed to be at her daughter's side that Easter weekend. In fact, immediately following the baptism, before Miriam's hair even had time to dry, I witnessed Hira do something she had never done before. She walked into the living room, settled into a comfortable chair, picked up the Bible, and began to read it. Hospitality for the sake of the gospel. There's a sense in which hospitality is not the big theme of 1 Peter, not at the same level of exile or suffering or hope or holiness. But it does feature highly here in 1 Peter 4, verses 8 to 10. Peter is coming towards the end of his letter. He's wrapping up his instructions, and he's given them a number of things as he reminds them that the end is near in verse 7. But then he says in verse 8, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. It's not surprising, is it? He says above all love, because the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second, which is like it, is to love your neighbour as yourself. It is the big thing that we are called to. And so Peter says, above everything else, love each other deeply. But actually, it's that love that lies behind all the other commands in this letter. Why should we be humble and respect others? Because we love them. Why should we not slander or revile? Because we love people. Why should we walk in holiness? And why should we declare God's praises? Because we love other people. All of Christian law is encapsulated in that one command, love. But it's interesting then how Peter lands that very quickly. Having said, love each other above all, what does he then say immediately in the next verse? Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. What's the key way to express our love? Hospitality. He goes on then to talk about service in the life of the church, using our gifts for the benefit of the whole church. This great command to love, and sandwiched between the two is hospitality, this loving generosity towards others. It's almost as though Peter envisions hospitality as one of the key vehicles for our loving each other and serving each other. Now, in Peter's day, hospitality was crucial. You didn't have the Premier Inn and whatever other brand there might be. And so as there are gospel preachers traveling the world and getting the good news of Jesus out, they would look for homes to stay in. And so the church family would welcome their visiting preacher to come and stay, and he'd be there for a little bit of time. And they'd literally have him in the house with them. And actually, there were no church buildings. Not for a good few hundred years yet. And so where did they meet? In their homes. Usually the person with the biggest house would invite everyone else around to meet in their lounge or in their upper room. And so hospitality was part of their week in, week out worship. It was crucial, both for the preacher and for the assembly. Now, no doubt, that took its toll. Although their culture is different to ours, and it was more common then than now, we have the same temptations. Putting up people in your home is hard work. When they don't like the food you offer, and when they snore loudly at night, and when they're fussy, and when they're hard work, and you spend the evening with them and you're utterly drained, when all those church folks have been in your house again and that precious vase has just been smashed and they've left a mess and no one's bothered hoovering up when they left, it's hard work, it's wearing, being hospitable. And so Peter immediately has to add, offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. It is hard work. What's Peter saying? Look, you're to love each other cheerfully and share your most valuable resources, even your homes, for the sake of Christ. Now, here in 1 Peter chapter 4, that's primarily addressed to believers. He's saying to them, you're going to need each other while you're an oppressed minority. He immediately goes on to speak about the fiery trial. When the world's against you, what do you need? You need to be together more than ever. But it would be a mistake to think that Peter means that this is just for believers. Homes and tables, said Jesus, aren't to be reserved just for people like us. Matthew 5:47. If you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Even the pagans do that. There is a Christian call for hospitality, which is to love outsiders. The Greek word for hospitality compounds the word love with the word stranger. It implies opening your home to sinners. And so actually, if we're going to be making Christ known in our culture, hospitality is essential, particularly as the squeeze comes on. Elliot Clark writes, "It was definitely our family's experience in Central Asia. We didn't have the opportunity for large outreach events. Cold call evangelism wasn't a viable option, and we couldn't count solely on visitors coming to church. In a Muslim-majority country, you can't hire the big local hall and invite everybody in. You can't go knocking on everybody's door. You can't assume that anybody's going to wander into church. So what do? In the case of Hira and many others like her, we employed hospitality for the sake of the gospel. We invited our Muslim friends and neighbours into our home for a meal. If they weren't comfortable eating at our house, perhaps for religious reasons, it wasn't the right way to have done the meat and all the rest of it, we'd go to theirs, or we'd meet them in a restaurant or cafe. Making Christ known over a meal." And think about it. When Jesus calls Matthew the tax collector to follow him, what does Matthew immediately do in his gospel? We read that he invited all the other tax collectors and sinners to his house for a great banquet. That didn't happen off the cuff. He didn't just go home and say, "Wifey, I'd like, No, that must have taken some planning to get the food in and to invite everybody. It was a deliberate thing because he wanted them to hear about Jesus. More than that, he wanted them to meet Jesus. So he invites Jesus and all these other people for a banquet, to eat at his house so they can meet and hear him. It wasn't just a social occasion. And Jesus himself makes it clear in Luke 5:27-32 that he's come to call the righteous, not call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. He's come to those who are unwell. So he delights to be at that party. He delights to be at Matthew's house with all those unbelievers, because these are the people who need the gospel. In fact, as you read through Luke's gospel, Jesus is either going to a meal, at a meal, or leaving a meal. It's all around the table. And so there's an invitation to the table. Now, part of the problem, because Christianity has been the established religion and because we have public buildings, we are used to people inviting people into things that we run. We have public services of worship. Now you don't find that in the scriptures. That's because of our Christianized culture, where we open our doors and people are welcome to come in public buildings. We run children's work and so on and invite people in. Now, that's not necessarily wrong, but actually as Christianity becomes a minority faith, as we're squeezed to the margins, that idea is going to have less and less traction. Certainly in our community, a lot of local parents do not want to send their kids to church youth groups because Christianity is bad news, because it's oppressive. Elliot Clark was listening to an interview with a researcher from the University of Chicago who was studying the effects of sharing a meal when negotiating a business transaction. Perhaps Jeremy can share some light on this. She said that over the course of the study, she found that those who ate together, specifically the same menu, were more likely to come to a settlement faster. While the research didn't reveal a definitive cause, her findings suggested a strong link between the experience of a shared meal and arriving at a mutual agreement. Elliot Clark is not saying that the silver bullet to evangelism is getting someone to eat a meal with you, and bingo, they're going to accept Christ. But he is saying there's something very significant about sitting at a table together and eating. It's a great leveler. Instead of us on the pulpit preaching at people, it's sitting together and sharing food and opening our lives and talking about the things that matter. It demonstrates love and service. It has a way of opening doors for communication, and so actually inviting people to food with us has such an important ministry in making Christ known. People who wouldn't come into a public building to a Christian service may well come to Costa to have a coffee with us, or come to our house for a meal. People who are indifferent to religion or disinclined to Christianity may well, because they know us from work or school or wherever, come and hang out with us over a meal and talk. Matthew, in his gospel, says in chapter 8, verse 11, "I say to you that many will come from the east and the west, and many will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven." That great heavenly feast. There's a whole world of people going to be there. And almost straight after, in the next chapter, he talks about Jesus having a meal with Matthew's friends. What's the methodology that Jesus is commending for making him known to get everybody to the final great feast? Feasting now, around the table. And actually, I think as we face increasing hostility as a minority in our country, we are going to need to rediscover the necessity of hospitality for the gospel. Already, lots of churches are seeking to buy their own buildings who have been meeting in schools. Previously, 15, 20 years ago, I was in meetings where church pastors were saying, we don't want a building, it's a millstone, let's use a school, we'll just pay them on the weekend. But now they're not allowed to meet in the schools because they can't sign up to the whatever legislation, the inclusiveness and all of those sorts of things. And so public spaces are getting squeezed and we can't use those so much. Maybe there will come a day where even only our own buildings will be more complex, but actually inviting people into our homes, meeting in a coffee shop, it's a great opportunity for the gospel. And we need to think seriously about this. Now, we looked last week about being visibly different and living holy lives, set apart to live for Jesus. And there can be a feel, and I think it has happened in our churches in the past, where our desire to be holy and set apart and different has meant that we've ended up in a Christian bubble. I think growing up, we were in church 3 times on a Sunday, the youth group was on a Tuesday, prayer meeting was on Thursday, Dad was an elder, he was out at other meetings through the week. We were saturated in church. It was great, but we didn't have any time for non-Christians. Where were they going to fit in? Well, it's all right, they'll come. We'll go out on the doors and they'll come to church on a Sunday. And maybe it did a generation ago, but less now. But the problem with that is that we feel secure with our own, don't we? It's safe in a bubble. The more dark and dangerous the world out there gets, the more we'll just have our own holy huddles. But actually, when Jesus commands us to live a set-apart life, it's not to be a ghetto. Do you remember he says in John's Gospel, we need to be not of the world, absolutely, but we do need to be in the world. Jesus, who was the Holy One, shocked the religious establishment by spending most of his time with the people who were looked down on and despised in his culture. Luke 7 verse 34, the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say he's a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. They hated him for it. And Jesus says, this is who I've come to save. This is what I'm here for. And we have numerous stories, don't we then, in the Gospels of the religious leaders being scandalized when the woman washes his feet, when the people he hangs out with don't make sense, when he invites himself to Zacchaeus' house for tea. I mean, what's he playing at? Well, he's seeking lost sheep. He's being holy, set apart for God's service. What is that? To love those who are lost. Holiness is not the enemy of hospitality, quite the opposite. In fact, Peter puts holiness and love for others together. 1 Peter 1 verse 22, now that you have purified yourselves by obeying the truth, so that you have sincere love for each other, love one another deeply from the heart. True holiness is loving, and it drives us towards one another, not apart from others. I find this very helpful reading a book recently called Gentle and Lowly. It's the only time we get a self-description for Jesus of what he's like. And he says, what is he like? He's gentle and lowly. And in that book, the author talks about the difference between Jesus and the Pharisees. Both are obsessed with holiness. Jesus and the Pharisees both want to be holy. What do the Pharisees do? In their desire to be holy, they look at anything that's unholy and step away. They look down on it. They despise it. They don't want to be anywhere near it because it's dirty and they might get contaminated. As Jesus, as he longs to be holy, pleasing to the Father, what does he do? He steps towards it all the time. To the leper, to the woman caught in sin, to the woman at the well. Stepping towards, extending God's love and invitation. We see this kindness and this grace in the Lord Jesus Christ. And he even tells the story, doesn't he, of the Good Samaritan to demonstrate again the shocking nature of being a true neighbour is to cross the boundaries of what we would think would be cleanliness and holiness and step towards hospitality. the Levi and the priest see the man on the side of the road and he's probably dead and that will contaminate them, so they want to step away. And there might be robbers around, it might be dangerous, so we'll keep well away from him. The Samaritan steps towards him, picks him up, takes him to the hotel, pays for his keep, looks after him, extends generosity. This is the picture that Jesus paints. Through the book, Elliot Clark often writes of the African American slaves in America and their experience as exiles and how that stands out, and we can learn from our brothers and sisters who were there. And he quotes a man called James Redpath, who was a reporter working for the New York Tribune in the mid-1800s. And James Redpath recounts his travels in the southern states. And he was traveling one night through the Carolinas, and he was lost, he was alone, there was a storm, clouds of ink blotted out the moon and the stars, there was a rumble in the distance. He saw a plantation's lights and he made for it. But when he asked about emergency lodging, they told him to get lost. When he pleaded with them, this is the only place for miles, and look at the weather, no, go away. So he gave in and went his way down some railroad tracks, hoping to find another option. But there was nothing else anywhere. So he went back to this plantation to plead for hospitality, but they would have nothing to do with him. And finally, as the rain began to pour down, he spotted a small Negro hut in the distant woods. And he ran for cover. And although they were suspicious, they welcomed him. And in that crowded shack, where there was probably not enough room for any of them to lie down, they made space for him to be dry with them. And as he later reflected on that experience and his collective observations from his extensive travels in the South, he wrote this. This has got real punch. I did not see any of that celebrated hospitality for which Southerners are perpetually praising themselves. They are very hospitable to strangers who come to them well introduced, who don't need hospitality. In fact, but they are very much the reverse when a stranger presents himself under other and unfavourable circumstances. The richer class of planters are especially inhospitable. The Negroes are the hospitable class of the South. You want a welcome home, he says? Go to the exiles. Go to the Christian slaves. They'll welcome you into your home. The tragedy is most of those white planters would have been professing Christians sat in the front pews of their churches on a Sunday. They would have people to their dinner party who were in their class and status, this wonderful welcoming hospitality, but not anyone who was in need. And the challenge is for us too. We can end up, our Christian hospitality too often looks like a tea party where we invite people and all the best china comes out. And it's people who are like us. We'll invite the people we get on with in church. But real hospitality is like that of those Negro slaves. It doesn't require limitless resources or the best dishes or the open plan room where you can have a lovely fellowship together. The only requirement for hospitality is love and a willingness to serve others. And if we're going to make a difference for the gospel, if we're going to make Christ known in our culture increasingly, we are going to need to use our homes and tables as an extension of the kingdom. There needs to always be plenty of room. But holiness is not the enemy of the hospitality. Hospitality is actually part of the gospel. Let's think about this briefly. Elliot Clark writes this: if you ever visited Asma's apartment, you would instantly know something was wrong. Upon opening the front door, even before entering, the smell of mildew would greet you. Once inside, you notice her belongings and textbooks were covered in mold. Her home was dark, dank, and probably unsafe to occupy. But she couldn't afford anything better. As it was, she often needed help from us just to keep the heat on. Asma was a young Central Asian believer in significant financial trouble. Her parents, becoming suspicious of her conversion, had withdrawn their financial support. She could no longer pay for school, so she dropped out of college halfway through. In the first year we knew her, she was able to find employment at a home goods store. But even working endless days and weekends, she couldn't make a livable wage. The following summer, Asma was desperate for a break from work. She also wanted out of her damp apartment, so she decided to visit family. Having scraped together enough money to buy a ticket, she took the 12-hour bus ride home, only to never return. What exactly happened when she reunited with her family was hard to ascertain. For one, her availability to talk on the phone or social media was severely limited. Her parents had confiscated her belongings. They told her they wouldn't allow her to return to the city where she had Christian friends. In the end, they basically held her hostage in her own house. In fact, a full 2 years passed before Asma was able to come back, still without her parents' blessing, to our former city. She managed to enroll in the local university, but she was still struggling financially. The challenge of taking a full course load and providing for her needs continued to weigh heavily. Knowing of her constant struggles, I reached out to check in on her situation and let Asma know of our prayers. She messaged back to say that her parents continued to be angry, her father was still refusing to help with her living expenses, but she reported with thanksgiving that a believing Christian Canadian family had provided their home as a place to stay, one that was clean and safe. As I prepared to sign off, I wrote, "Your brothers and sisters in America love you." To which Asma quickly replied, "I'm so happy to be part of this family. I'm just happy to be a stone in this temple." Then she added, "I love you, my family, very much." What you quickly realize living in a Muslim nation where Christians are an extreme minority is that hospitality isn't just a method of evangelism. Hospitality becomes part of the gospel offer. When people turn from the faith of their birth family and inherited faith to follow Christ, they will embrace a lifelong experience of exile. They will face social persecution. Their families will disown them. They can lose their place at school, their job, their spouse, even their children. They might quite literally be kicked to the curb. So when you present the gospel to them, you need to be ready to present an offer of a place to stay. Elliot Clark writes, "In fact, I know of at least one church in their country where we live that had reserved rooms in their sanctuary for that very purpose. They knew if the church was going to grow through conversion, they needed to provide a home for the converts. If someone expressed interest in following Christ and being baptized, the congregation was prepared to put them up for a time. If their relatives became incensed or violent, or if they disowned them, the new believers would have an immediate place of refuge." You might see how providing temporary housing could be helpful or even necessary in certain contexts, writes Elliot Clark, but maybe not in the West. However, I'm convinced it will be in the days ahead. As family and friends react in anger at their loved one's conversion, as becoming a Christian means stepping away from a partner and a house, an occupation and income, or leaving a whole community. As new followers of Christ walk into immediate exile, in such situations the church will need to provide the family and home that the gospel promises. Doesn't Jesus remind us that there is a reward of homes and family? It occurs in the context of Mark chapter 3, verse 21. I'm not going to spend long on this, but Jesus is out ministering and his family are thinking he's lost his mind. And so as he's rejected by the religious leaders, we then find the family coming to the house where he's teaching to take him home. They're embarrassed. They're going to undermine him publicly. And when Jesus learns that Mary and her sons are calling for him to come out, his response is rather curt. Mark 3:34. Then he looked at those seated in a circle round him and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. My mother and my brothers are those who do the will of God." Jesus was abandoned, forsaken by his own people and even by his own family. They were embarrassed and they wanted him to come home. And Jesus says, "I've got another family." And then we find that Jesus, as he is speaking to the rich young ruler, calling him to leave behind his goods, and talks about how difficult it is for rich people to enter the kingdom of heaven, and then promises, he's talking to Peter, and Peter says, "We've left everything to follow you." And he says, "Yeah, no one who's left home or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for me and the gospel will fail to receive 100 times as much in this present age, homes, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, fields, along with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life." Actually, part of the gospel itself is a new family, is a new community, is a new home, is a new place to be, a new identity. Can't you see it? That the reward of the gospel includes houses and families. And increasingly, as we are a minority in our country, we are going to need to be better at this. And it's particularly difficult when there are big, strong family networks. We were just joking at lunchtime. I remember growing up in our church, we used to have a Christmas postbox every year. And Dad used to sort the envelopes and we'd help him. And yet the Gampston pile was like this. And the Eagles pile was like this. And the Greens pile was like this. Now the trouble with that is those family networks work together in the church. And then there are people on their own. And they don't feel they can get in because everyone's related. And they don't feel part of things. And we have to work really hard at this. As people follow Jesus, they will become displaced from our community and from their families potentially, and so the church needs to be that family for them. The gospel is about a future feast, but it also talks about homes now. It's a seat at the table now as a foreshadowing of what is to come. It is the gospel, isn't it? Let's finish with this. Honor and home. It's the story of David and Mephibosheth, one of those beautiful Bible stories. Mephibosheth is the grandson of Saul. He is dropped when the defeat comes that leads to Saul and his son's death, and he's crippled. So he's looked down on in his culture. He's disabled. But also he's related to the past king, and in those cultures, when you came to the throne, you disposed of everybody related to the last king because they were a threat to your rule. And so David goes to see Mephibosheth, not to wipe him out, but because of his love for Jonathan, to invite him to the table. And poor disabled Mephibosheth eats at the king's table for the rest of his days. Folks, that's the picture of the gospel. That's what we've been invited to. That's where we're heading, to the king's table. But because of Jesus' love for us, we want to open up our tables to others. We want to remind ourselves of what's to come. We want to have a foretaste of that as much as possible now. So in our discussion groups this week, we've got some questions to think about. Do we use our homes as a means to introduce people to Jesus? Are there people you know who would never go to church, but you could invite them to your dinner table? It's worth thinking about which cultures that works better in, whether it's our dinner table or maybe whether it's a neutral venue. It's worth thinking through that conversation as well. Reflect on Jesus' profound experience of shame and isolation by his earthly family. What do his words about true brothers and sisters mean for us when we face the loss of family or friends? Is our hospitality limited to those whom we like and those who are like us? Does it need to change? And how does the gospel's promise of honour and a home transform our earthly exile, shame and exclusion? How should that hope shape us, our churches, and our evangelism? Plenty to think about as we discuss these things this week. But may we have an increasing sense of the home we're headed to. And may we in our lives be increasingly hospitable as we seek to make Jesus known to others.